This is the fourth in a series of 6 lectures on the final stage of Old Testament history, that of the return stage, and we're studying the book of Esther. I'd like to give you a brief outline now, or the introduction that's taken from my book on page 391 to set the stage for this, one of the most exciting books in all the Bible. In fact, I believe that with one or two possible exceptions, this is my favorite story, the historical account of how God saved His people. Esther is one of the 2 Old Testament books named after a woman. Of course, the other was Ruth, and I think God did this just to prove to the ladies that He is not a chauvinistic God. The name Esther, of course, means star, and the book here gives the story of those Jews living in Persia who did not return to Jerusalem after Cyrus's decree. Now, to pinpoint the historical account here, we need to consider the following dates. As we said so often now, the Jews first went back to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel and Joshua, the high priest, in 536 B.C. All right, now the temple, 20 years later, was completed in 516 B.C. And in 478 B.C., Esther, back in the land of Persia, now becomes queen. And some 5 years after she becomes queen, the crisis appears, and she is able to save her people. All right, and then in 455, years after that, Ezra returns to Jerusalem, and then Nehemiah goes back in 445. So these important dates now, 536, Zerubbabel goes back, 516, the temple was completed, 478, Esther becomes queen, 473, she saves her people in Persia, 455, Ezra goes back, and 445, Nehemiah returns. And so thus, as we say here in our notes, Esther appears upon the scene in history about 60 years after the decree of Cyrus, 60 years after Zerubbabel goes back, and about 35 years before Nehemiah returns. So somewhere in between the going back of Zerubbabel and the going back of Nehemiah, the book of Esther takes place. Now, of course, the name of God never appears in the book of Esther, and it is also not found in the Song of Solomon. And for this reason, the early church at first was somewhat reluctant to accept the book of Esther as a part of the inspired canon, but it was soon regarded as such. I've read several explanations why the name God does not appear in the book of Esther, and very frankly, none of these suggestions have been satisfying to me. I don't know why the name is not mentioned. But in spite of the omission of any name for deity in the book of Esther, there is no other book in all the Bible where God is more evident working behind the scenes than is this book. In fact, as we suggest later on, you could write Romans 8:28 across the pages of the book of Esther. For we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to His purpose. Of course, the key word in understanding Esther is the word providence, literally meaning to provide in advance. And providence has been defined by the great theologian Strong, Augustus Strong, as follows. He says, providence is that continuous agency of God by which He makes all events of the physical and moral world fulfill the original design with which He created it. It has also been defined as the hand of God in the glove of history. Dr. J. Vernon McGee suggests that providence is the last of 3 great facts which make up the sovereignty of God as witnessed by man. These are creation, which accounts for the existence of this universe, and preservation, which accounts for the continuation of the universe, and providence, which accounts for the progress and the development of this universe. Okay, now, with that in mind, I'd like for you to turn to the book of Esther, and this takes place, of course, during the reign of King Ahasuerus. This was also the Xerxes in Bible history. In fact, I'm going to turn back now to my notes and your notes on the book of Ezra, and on page 379, you'll probably need to check these 5 Persian kings out to find out where the book of Esther takes place. Cyrus the Great, of course, was the first of these 5 kings, and then his son, whose name was Cambyses, and then finally Darius the Great, that was the 3rd great man, and then Xerxes the first, and he is the Xerxes, the Ahasuerus of the book of Esther. So he is the 4th king, Xerxes the first. And then you have a fellow named Artaxerxes, or Xerxes the second. And Artaxerxes was the son of Xerxes the first, and he was the king that Nehemiah and Ezra had to do with. But we're examining now the book of Esther, and she's soon going to marry this 4th king, Xerxes the first. All right, so he's also, of course, the Ahasuerus of this book. Ahasuerus and Xerxes the first are the same person. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, or Xerxes the first, that in those days when he sat upon the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all the princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the province being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. So you talk about a feast. Here is a feast that lasted 180 days, about 6 months. All right, now, there was probably a reason for this festivity. We're not told in the book of Esther. It's not specifically stated, but I would imagine, history seems to indicate, that the festivities were for the purpose of raising the morale of his leaders and his soldiers, and psychologically to prepare them for a great expedition that Artaxerxes, or in this case Ahasuerus rather, had planned against the mortal enemy of Persia, which was Greece. And here a little background is necessary. You can read this background on page 391. It seems that his father, Darius the Great, remember that's the 3rd of these 5 Persian kings, had led a huge fleet to some 600 ships to some years before that, and they had attacked the Greek Isles and had been soundly defeated. That is to say, Ahasuerus' father now, Darius the Great. And he had been defeated by the Greeks some 10 years before that at the Battle of Marathon, one of the great battles in history. Now, he's attempting to raise another army, and he's going back, and he wants to subdue the Greek Isles, if for no other reason, to avenge the defeat of his father. But once an army has lost a battle, psychologically, the morale's not very good, so he's having a big shindig now, 180 days, sort of like Belshazzar did in Daniel chapter 5 when he invited 1,000 of his lords and ladies. All right, now, we continue on, and in verse 9 we read about the wife of Ahasuerus as the story opens. Of course, it's not Esther at this time. Her name is Vashti. And so when they're good and drunk, the king and some of his cronies, they say, hey, listen, why don't you bring Vashti out? And we hear she does a mean toe dance, and and let her put on a show for us. And actually, it was probably a sexual demonstration they wanted, a more or less excuse the expression, but a strip-tease act. That's what they were after, and in order to really arouse their drunken passions. And so the king has her to come in. And in verse 12, the queen has a mind of her own. But the queen, Vashti, refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king enraged, and his anger burned in him. So she said, you go tell those drunks they can get somebody else. I'm not about to parade myself before a bunch of winos. And that's literally probably what she said. Well, he was extremely angry, and so he called all of these wise men, and he said, now what'll I do about this? What shall we do? Verse 15, unto the queen, according to the law, because she has not performed the commandment of the king. Well, one of his crony friends, in verse 16, he said, all right, what you need to do, you've got to divorce that gal. And I'll tell you why, because if you don't, then the other ladies, in verse 18, he said, of Persia, they'll get ideas. And of course, he might have gone on to say, now we know from studying prophecy that the women's liberation movement won't take place until the 1960s in America. Well, maybe he didn't say that, but at any rate, he didn't want it to start then, this liberation movement. And so, we had to keep them in their place. And so he said, you better divorce the first lady here, or all of our other wives are going to get ideas. Well, in verse 21, the saying pleased the king, and he did send her a letter, or he wrote a letter, I should say, and he sent her away. And this was a divorce law now, and so they're officially separated. Well, that's how chapter 1 ends. Now, in chapter 2, after his anger had cooled, the Bible says that the king regretted his hasty action, and after he sobered up. But according to the law, the Medes and Persians, he could not take her back as his wife, even though he would have forgiven her and wanted to take her back. Of course, we remember when we read the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 6, Darius, who was also under Persian law, had made a law and found himself trapped by the law that he made, to the extent that that Daniel, his beloved prime minister, was going to be thrown to the lion's den. And that was the last thing on earth the king wanted, but he had to abide by that law. And now we have another man trapped in making a decree, this time while he was drunk. Now he regrets it, as all drunks often do. They do things that they regret later on, but now he can't change it. I suppose about this time he's probably pretty hard to live with. So maybe his servants get together and said, we've got to do something because the king may take it out on us. He may think later that we tricked him into signing this. So tell you what, let's stage an empire-wide beauty contest and a search for beautiful girls. And then the winner of this contest will become his new wife. And what they wanted to do now was to stage a Miss Persian beauty pageant, you see, and have all the contestants from all over the land. And then finally, they'll have a Bert Parks, headmaster, and he'll sing, there she comes, miscellaneous, or whatever they sang in those days. And then this beautiful girl could replace Vashti, and then the king's anger would cool, and perhaps he would treat the servants a lot better. So basically, this is what the situation was. All right, the contest lasts some 4 years. I mean, it took them a long time to gather from all over the kingdom and to be sent there to the Persian, place where that the contest took place. And so between, although we're not again told, but between the setting aside of Vashti in chapter 1 and the selection of Esther in chapter 2, you have a period of 4 years that goes by. And during that 4-year period, and again you can read about this and what happens, Ahasuerus, during that time, gathers an army of over 100,000 men, and he's going to attack the Greek Isles and try to avenge the defeat of his father. Well, he's also defeated. And in fact, he is more so defeated than what his father was. His army, his navy is almost wiped out. So he comes back, and he's really in a bad humor now. Not only has he lost his wife between chapter 1 and chapter 2, and the Bible doesn't tell us about that, but history does, but now he's practically lost his empire, and he's in no mood to fool around, as it were. But at any rate, so when he comes back, then the 4 years are over, and so they pretty well narrowed it down now to a few finalists in the Atlantic City beauty contest here in Persia, as it were. All right, in chapter 2, we read about a man whose name is Mordecai. In verse 5, now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. You know, class, it's amazing what you learn if you just read the Bible. And I was reading this the other day, rereading it in preparation for this lecture, and I never realized that Mordecai was a descendant of Kish. And you remember Kish was the father of King Saul. He was a Benjamite. And so Mordecai now comes from the line of Saul through Kish. The devil used Saul in some ways almost to at least in attempting to destroy David. Remember, David was sought by Saul. Now God is going to use a descendant of Saul by the name of Mordecai to help save the seed of David. So strange and marvelous and wonderful are the ways of God. At any rate, this godly Jew by the name of Mordecai, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives, and so apparently his father, we don't believe that Mordecai himself was carried away because he was probably born and raised in the land of Persia, but his father, now his family was carried away, and he was born and raised now in the city, or in the palace of Shushan now, and he is not only finding a new life for himself, but he has adopted his, could be his cousin or his niece, but I believe it was his niece, whose name is Hadassah. There's some question in the original whether this was his cousin or his niece, but I believe it was his niece. Her name was Hadassah, and her name also was Esther. Okay, so for the first time in the book, chapter 2, verse 7, this girl Esther is mentioned. All right, she also, because of her great beauty, is selected to be among some of the contestants for this beauty contest. Now in verse 10 we're told that Esther had not revealed to her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged to her that she should not make it known. And so what we're saying, what the Bible says here, is that Esther had not told anyone up to this point that she was a Jewish girl. And therein hangs our story a little later on. All right, the last part of chapter 2, Esther now becomes not only among the finalists, but she's elected now as the queen to take the place of Vashti. Verse 16, so Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Notice now, chapter 2, verse 16, she becomes his wife in the 7th year of his reign. But in chapter 1, verse 3, we're told that in the 3rd year of his reign, he made this big feast. And so that's what I said, between the setting aside of Hasty during his 3rd year and the marrying of Esther during his 7th year, a period of 4 years goes by. And the king loved Esther, verse 17, above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins that he had set the royal crown upon, so that he had set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Now, the king does not know that Esther is Jewish. And very frankly, with Esther's figure and her beautiful face, I don't think the king could have cared very much regarding her genealogy or her pedigree. He just knew that here's a beautiful specimen of womanhood, and he loved her, and she became his beloved wife. Verse 18, Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast, and he made a release from taxes in the provinces and gave gifts according to the bounty of the king. She becomes very popular now because the king lowers taxes, because his wrath is appeased now over losing that battle and also over losing his first wife Vashti. So she really was a beautiful queen. All right, now, again in verse 20 we read this important statement. Esther had not yet revealed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, just as when she was brought up with him. So Mordecai still now places her spiritual welfare under the direction of Mordecai. All right, something happens in verses 21, 22, and 23 that will play a big part in our story. After Esther gets into power, becomes the first lady, then she, of course, arranges to have Mordecai appointed to an important position, and his office, or at least his working headquarters, are right beside the king's gate. And he overhears a plot about this time, shortly after the marriage of Esther and Ahasuerus, from two of the bodyguards, or two of the tent, or the gatekeepers of the king. He overhears a plot on their part to put the king to death. Well, he reports what he's heard to Queen Esther. And Esther, without telling the king about it, she lets the proper officials know about it. These two would-be conspirators are arrested, and we're told in verse 23, when the inquiry was made of the matter, it was found out, therefore, it was checked out, and sure enough, this was what they were going to do. It was not a false rumor. Therefore, these conspirators were both hanged on a tree. Now, the last part of this verse is extremely important to what happens a little later on. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. Okay, now, I suppose they would have gotten married and lived happily forever after. But in chapter 3, we have a brand new ball game. Because some years after Esther became queen, Xerxes appointed as his prime minister a vicious politician named Haman. And Haman was an Amalekite, and he was a descendant from a former king of that nation whose name was Agag, and it was Agag that ruled in the days of Saul and Samuel. And he was a mortal enemy of Israel, and it will be remembered in 1 Samuel 15 that Saul disobeyed God and spared King Ahab in battle. Now, had he killed King Agag in battle, perhaps Haman would have never been born. But the Amalekites, at any rate, have been the bitter enemies of Israel from Israel's history way back in Exodus chapter 17. Now, this arrogant Haman was appointed, as I say, next to the king himself, and he really becomes sort of the Adolf Hitler of the Old Testament. Well, he sets a little precedent that when he goes by, everybody's to curtsy. And so some of his crony friends who follow him around now realize that there is a fellow who has a business office next to the palace gate there, whose name is Mordecai, and Mordecai doesn't do this little curtsy act. He doesn't bow when Haman struts by. And so they tell Haman, do you know there's a fellow that doesn't bow down when you walk by? And Haman said, who is he? And said, well, you notice his name is Mordecai. And Haman noticed, and sure enough, he didn't do that little bow. And Haman is extremely angry, and he checks him out and finds out that he's a rather important official, but he's also a Jew. And so Haman now hatches a plot to exterminate not only Mordecai, but every other Jew living in the Persian Empire. Instead of dirtying his hands to kill Haman or to kill Mordecai, he decides to do this. I know what I'll do. I'll arrange a plan here to get rid of the entire dog. And if you get rid of the dog, the fleas die with it. And that's about what how he looked upon the Jewish people. So what does he do? He goes to Ahasuerus, and in verse 8 of chapter 3, he says, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are different from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. This was a brazen lie, but the truth never bothered Haman a bit. Therefore, he says, it is not for the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver. That's $20 million that Haman was offering now. 10,000 talents of silver unto the hands of those who have the charge of this business to bring it into the king's treasuries. Verse 10, and the king took his ring from his hand and gave it unto Haman. Verse 11, I think, probably gives us a very accurate, if not chilling, description of the true nature of Ahasuerus. He was a very, very cold-blooded and callous man. Without even checking on the authenticity and the accuracy of this report, indeed, without even checking right away upon the identity of the people, he says this, the silver is given to thee, the people also, to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. I already said, I'll let you do. You want to exterminate them? It's not for my profit that they should live. And you see what Haman was doing is what Hitler did later. He was proposing the final solution. Of course, that statement came from Adolf Eichmann, Hitler's henchman, and the final solution was the extermination of every single Jew, eventually, in all the world. And now, these two men are determining to do this with the Jews some 6 centuries B.C. And he says, not only can you do what you want to do, but you won't even have to give me any money for doing this. Keep your silver. Well, Haman wasn't about to give out any silver in the first place in the long run, because what he had in mind, doubtless, he was going to make far more than $20 million. He was going to make many times that figure, by confiscating the lands and the pawn shops and everything else of the Jews. Doubtless he had planned to do later what Hitler would do, have special pliers and tongs prepared to pull out the gold teeth of the Jews and melt it down in great balls of gold. He was going to take everything that the Jews had. Well, he walks away from that palace almost floating on air, because he's not only now going to get rid of Mordecai, not only is he going to be allowed to exterminate all the Jews, and apparently he hated them very much. But he was also now going to make millions and millions of dollars, and it wasn't going to cost him 1 cent. Well, the copy is given now, and once the law of the Medes and Persians have gone out, it is irrevocable. We'll see this later, even after the king found out that he had been had, as King Darius had done in the book of Daniel. They were both powerless to change it, and we'll see later how the Jews are spared. But the law is out now. In verse 15, the last part of the verse is very significant. After it went out by special messenger to all the bulletin boards of the kingdom, the king and Haman sat down to drink. That's quite a statement. Here they have cold-bloodedly planned now the assassination of, well, I say millions, of many, many thousands, perhaps as many as 1 million, we don't know, but certainly tens of thousands of innocent men and women, especially innocent children, boys and girls. And what happens now with these bloody hands and brutal hearts? They sit down to drink. The last part of the verse is also significant, the last 6 words. But the city, Shushan, was perplexed. Literally means they were disturbed, they were troubled. The Jews apparently had a fairly good testimony in the city, and when the Gentiles, the Persians, in and around Shushan and the palace read this, they were concerned. They said, well, why does the king and Haman decide to kill the Jews? These are good citizens, they're not traitors. Their laws, they're little different as far as their religious views are concerned, but they're pretty good citizens, and I wonder why this is taking place. The city, Shushan, was perplexed. All right, in chapter 4, Mordecai, of course, learns all that was done. So he puts on sackcloth and ashes, and he goes out into the center of the city, and he sits down, and he mourns and weeps with a loud voice. Well, it isn't long before one of the chamberlains was waiting upon the maidens, waiting upon Esther, and Esther doubtless has told her inner circle of friends that Mordecai is her uncle, and so she reports, one of the girls reports, and do you know that your uncle Mordecai is out there weeping as if his heart would break? Well, Esther doesn't understand what's happening. She's rather shielded. She doesn't see these laws. And so she finds out by way of a runner what's going on, and Mordecai then tells her why he's weeping. And then he says this in verse 13, Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, Think not within thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their relief and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. So he says, now don't you think that you'll escape simply because you're the queen. Because later on, they'll probably find you out too. And the last part of verse 14 is actually of chapter 4 a summary of the book of Esther and perhaps of the entire Christian life. Let me read this. Here Mordecai is saying to Esther, And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? There used to be a cartoon entitled Born 40 Years Too Soon. And now as I say that, does it say 40 years too soon or 40 years too late? But at any rate, whatever the cartoon was about, a fellow that was born out of season, as it were. And did you ever wonder what period in history you'd rather live in? In a secular university that I attended, they asked that. And about 90% of the students preferred to live in another time in history rather than the time that they found themselves living in. Listen, I hope you never make that tragic mistake. Do you know that you were born at the proper time, just as Jesus Christ in the appointed time came into the world, and you came into the world? It was not an accident. Your parents may not have planned it that way, but God did. And you can do a job for the Lord that you could not have done had you been born in any other time in history. Well, we must run on. And at any rate, Esther determines that she's going to do something about it. So she goes in to see the king. Now, this was literally taking her life in her own hands because she had not been invited in for some 30 days, and you just didn't go in and talk with the king. I don't care if you were his wife in those days, and if you walked in unexpected and uninvited, chances are you would be taken out and hanged from the nearest tree. This was a symbol, this was a token, I should say, or a sign of terrible disrespect. And she walked in, though, and I suppose all the palace room itself, the attendants suddenly froze in their tracks because here this queen comes in and everybody knows she's not expected, and the king looks up and he thinks to himself, what in the world? She really must have some request of life-shaking importance because she's taking her life in her own hands. And so finally he holds up in his hand, he makes an upward gesture with a scepter, and that means you found favor in my sight. And he said, what is it? And he says, I'll give you anything you want, O Esther, up to half my kingdom. Did you ever wonder why he offered her that? Well, he did, because, of course, he realized she'd taken her life in her own hands, and he felt this was a very important thing. And she said, well, I'll tell you what I'd like, O king. I'm preparing a banquet tomorrow, and I'd like for you and Haman to come. And then he says he will, and then as he leaves, I suppose he shakes his head and says maybe to one of his attendants, you know, I guess I'll never understand women. I mean, I didn't even know she could cook, and here she's taking her life in her own hands. But at any rate, the banquet is all set, and Haman hears about it, and of course, he's really walking on air. And in chapter 5, verse 6, he went forth with a joyful and a glad heart. But he said, when he saw Mordecai, that he was full of indignation. Verse 10, nevertheless, Haman restrained himself when he came home. And he sent and he called for Zeresh, his wife, and all of his friends, and now he gives sort of a report on how great I am. Not how great thou art, but how great I am. And he tells all of his riches and his glory. Verse 12, he said, moreover, the queen did let no man come in with the king unto a banquet that she had prepared but myself, and tomorrow am I invited unto her also with the king. But he said, in verse 13, I've got everything now, yet all this availeth me nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. I just can't enjoy this. And the queen says, or Zeresh, his wife, says, don't worry about that, husband. Tomorrow morning, because it's going to be a few months before you're going to be able to get all the Jews killed, just get the king's permission and hang Mordecai from a gallows, and then you can enter to the banquet and not have this little thing worrying you. So he decides to do that, and that very night he had a gallows to be made some 70 feet high. Unbelievable here now. And so this is ready. Now, in chapter 6, one of the great chapters in the Bible, the Scripture tells us that on that night the king could not sleep. So on one side of the city, the very night the gallows are being built, the king has a royal insomnia, and the Jewish Johnny Carson show wasn't very interesting that night, and so he decided, I'll have somebody come in and read the Chronicles of the Kingdom, and they'll read some dull books, and I'll go to sleep. And so they came in, and the fellow just happened to open up the book to the place where years before that, a fellow named Mordecai had saved the king's life. Well, the king is really awake now, and he's props himself up on his elbows. He said, hey, listen. He said, has there been anything done? This guy saved my life. Has he been rewarded for that? He said, hey, fellas, I want to encourage this kind of action. And they said, no, I don't think so. And so he said, I've got to do something for him. Well, meanwhile, right before this, on the other side of the city, there's another case of insomnia. Haman can't sleep. And he said, I'm not going to wait till tomorrow to hang that critter. I'm going to get permission tonight to hang him. And so he makes his way now, and there's a knock on the door. And so the king says, who's knocking on my door this time of the night? And they go down, and they say, it's Haman. Oh, good. Bring him in. And now, this is really ironical. They both come in, or both get together now. Both have Mordecai on their mind. One wants to crown him, the other wants to kill him, and neither knows what the other's thinking about. So he said, hey, I'm glad you've come here. And in verse 6 he says, in chapter 6 to Haman, what shall be done for the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to honor more than myself? Hey, folks, this is fantastic, isn't it? So, probably he's got me in mind. So he said, oh, well, this is what I'd like, he said. And just notice what he says here. All the things that the king should do to this fellow that he wants to honor. He should let the royal apparel be brought and let him get on the horse that the king wears and give him a ticker-tape parade. Take him through the city. Let every knee bow. That should be done to the man, whoever he is. Of course, he felt it was himself. Now, we get paid at Thomas Road every other week, and honestly, I don't make a lot of money, but I would give at least one paycheck and maybe two paychecks to see what took place right after this. In verse 10, after he finished, then the king said to Haman, make haste, good idea, and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so for Mordecai the Jew. Couldn't you imagine the unbelievable look on the face of Haman? Well, he had to do that. And the Bible says that he did all this. And in verse 12, then Mordecai came again to the king's gate. He really got a kick out of it. But Haman hasted to his house mourning and having his head covered. Well, he's out of the frying pan into the fire. He goes home and tells his wife what's happened. She said, oh, listen, I remember reading about he's of the Jewish race, and there's a prophecy, I think, by Abraham, one of their books, that says, blessed is, I'll bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And she says, if Mordecai is of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. And sure enough, now they come to bring him to the banquet, and at the banquet, then Esther makes her request. Haman still doesn't know what she's going to say, and she said, O king, here is my request. Let my life be preserved. Let your life be preserved. Esther, I love you. Who's trying to kill you? She said, there's someone that's trying to kill me and all my relatives. And the king says, who is he and where is he? Verse 5 of chapter 7. She turns and says, it's Haman. And the truth comes out, and Artaxerxes, Ahasuerus, is so angry because he just assumes, of course, that Haman knew this when he plotted in the first place, which Haman didn't, and to get rid of Esther. So he walks out to try to cool off, and Haman is so terrified he falls on the bed where Esther is, attempting to beg for his life. And the king comes back in again, and he misinterprets this. He sees her on the bed, and he says, it's not enough that you try to kill her, now you're trying to rape her. And that's really what he said. And so he now determines, the story will come to an end. I'm running out of time. He determines then that Haman be hanged from the same gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai to be hanged upon. And what a story we have here. The remaining part of the book of Esther then gives us the account of how the Jews were allowed to defend themselves against the soldiers of the king, how they did defend themselves, and how the story has a wonderful ending. In chapter 10, then King Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and the coast and everything, and he now takes the ring that he had once given Haman and puts it upon Mordecai and makes him, in place of Mordecai, in place of Haman, his prime minister. Again, the book of Esther, Romans 8:28. All things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose.